session on the stakeholder versus shareholder concept. We'll start with the definition. So the definition of a stakeholder is anyone with an interest in the business. And of course, these stakeholders can be internal or external. An internal stakeholder would be an employee, an external stakeholder would be a supplier. Now, a similar but very different term, and therefore very different approach, is that of shareholders. And shareholders are those that own a share of a company. And they own that share of a company likely to obtain dividends or to obtain capital appreciation, being their shares go up in value. Now, the traditional approach of the 70s and the 80s especially was that shareholders would appoint managers, and those managers would serve the shareholders in order to allow those shareholders to get dividends or get capital appreciation. And essentially the only objective of managers was to do that, to allow their shareholders to maximise their dividends and maximise their share appreciation, their capital appreciation. So that is the stakeholder approach. Now, time moved on, and now we have a more modern approach. And the modern approach being that of the stakeholder concept, which is becoming more and more important over time, is that managers must consider more than just the shareholders. And the reason why is that over time, the pursuit of profit has led to externalities. And externalities are essentially third-party effects. They could be benefits or costs, but in this case, we're talking more costs of a company selling to customers. And what I mean by that is there's two parties in a transaction. There's the producer and then there's the consumer. But it might be someone else outside of the producer and the consumer is affected by the pursuit of profit. That could be the community, because there could be an impact on the community, being noise pollution or air pollution. There could be an impact on ethics. Perhaps the company they exploited their suppliers, or they weren't ethical within their supply chain. Or it could be there's an impact on employees. Perhaps they're not paying a fair wage, or perhaps they're not training enough to keep their costs lower. So those are all potential externalities that could come out of the pursuit of profit. So therefore, managers must consider more than just their shareholders. So the more modern approach is as follows: that managers take into account all stakeholders in their decision making, leading to a mutually beneficial result in the long term. So this is the modern approach, as opposed to the traditional approach of only objective is just to make sure their shareholders are happy. The last thing to think about is possible CSR approaches. So it could be a company takes on the bare minimum CSR, they just do exactly what they're obliged to do. The next step up is they might prioritise their long-term stakeholders, but not every stakeholder. Perhaps they prioritise their suppliers if they're strategically important to the business and ensure those stakeholders are kept happy. And the last and final one, perhaps the largest of the CSR approaches, is that they might make stakeholders part of their corporate objectives, maybe even their mission statements. Therefore, they might even make pleasing all stakeholders, not just shareholders, a wider objective, and perhaps even ahead of profit itself. The last thing to consider is that all of these stakeholder and shareholder concepts and CSR approaches should be considered alongside Carroll's CSR pyramid. For details on that, it's just about there. See you in next sesh.